Order, order. Tim Loughton to move the motion.
Sir, but I beg to move that this House has considered post office closures.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful for the opportunity from the Backbench Business Committee to discuss this very important subject, and certainly the number of honourable and right honourable members here this morning suggest it is something of an important subject, and who would have thought that there's an election on as well. I'm aware that many people want to speak, so I'll try and keep my comments as briefly as possible. If honourable members want to intervene rather than make their own speeches, and I'll try to take some interventions. And it wouldn't be my intention to take a response at the end as well, if that will help on timings. Now, I appreciate the previous debates on this subject, as recently as November, led by the honourable gentleman for Loughton North, which aired many of the issues which I'm sure honourable members will want to repeat again today. But of course, there is concern about possible delays to future plans for the Post Office caused by the ensuing election. And of course, there were outstanding concerns from that debate in November, which I think the Minister was rather rudely cut off from divisions, which, again, it will be good to get some clarity on today. I just want to mention briefly two areas. Firstly, my own local post office closures, and I'm sure everybody will have a local post office closure they want to air, but also the bigger picture of the long-term sustainability and game plan of the whole post office network. Can I first say to Edward, just put on record, I think, to recognise the good work that has been done by the government since 2011, where the network has been stabilised. The number of closures has actually been reduced substantially. The subsidy to the network has been managed down from 210 million in 2012 to some 80 million this year, due to flexibilities under some of the new arrangements, where there are upsides as well as downsides, has meant there's something like 200,000 additional opening hours every week, many of them at weekends when post offices will normally be closed. And some £2 billion has been invested in the network transformation plan since 2012. And that is in a contrast to previous years, where effectively half the network branches were closed in the previous 10 years or so. And certainly I lost more than half of my post office, sub-post office branches in my constituency. And certainly when I became an MP in 1997, there were nearly 20,000 branches, and of course that's now down to about 11,500. So there are some encouraging signs, but some very worrying signs if all of a sudden you are faced with the closure of post offices in your own area. And when the branches were being closed, we were promised that the Crown post offices were absolutely sacrosanct and would remain the main flagship of the post office on the high street. And they are very important parts of the local community, post office branches and the Crown post offices. Local businesses, retail and other small businesses rely on them heavily. If you don't have an excuse to come to the high street to use the post office, you don't use some of the neighbouring shops. They act as community hubs, and in areas like mine with a high pensioner population, they are particularly well used by the elderly population and by those from disadvantaged backgrounds, particularly those who don't have their own conventional bank accounts as well. And so it's for those reasons that the post office remains very popular and well used, with something like 17 million customers a week. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. I congratulate him on obtaining this debate. But is it not a case that government needs to look at the services that post offices provide, because they're losing those, and also the return that they're getting on providing that service?
Well, that's a very important point that I'd like to come on to, because it's a question of why isn't the post office growing rather than retrenching. So in 2016, the Post Office announced the closure of 31 Crown Post Office branches, even though the Crown offices are now breaking even, having made a 46 million loss some 4 years ago. Now, some of those post offices have not been converted into the new type of post offices, and their future is still uncertain. And then in January of this year, a further 37 Crown post offices were identified for closure, including the last 2 remaining ones in my constituency in Lancing and Shoreham. This caused huge worry and concern amongst constituents, gave rise to lots of petitions and demonstrations across all parties. And what was particularly disrespectful is the first I found out about it was when a constituent rang me up to ask me what I was doing about it. The Post Office didn't even have the courtesy to actually let the sitting member or the councillors know what they were planning to do. So I organised an urgent meeting with the Post Office, and they went through the procedures. And I was reassured because firms like W.H. Smith's have taken on more than 100 of these franchises, and everything is supposedly working well. And there are other chains of firms that have taken on, including, I gather, something called Bargain Booze, which is an off-licence which has some 30 post office chains, which some members may have concerns about the appropriateness of that. I was told that both those branches were unprofitable, and that's why they were going to be franchised out. Yet the Lancing branch in my constituency, apart from one very small sub-post office right on the fringe of the village of Lancing, now looks after a population of 27,000 people for one post office. Not surprisingly, queues are frequent. It also services the second largest business park in the whole of West Sussex, with 228 firms employing more than 3,000. And the village has lost almost all of its bank branches. And we were told when we lose those banks that, of course, you can do all those banking services at the post office, so there's no great concern anyway. Now, if those branches are not making a profit, it suggests to me they're not being run very well, because it's certainly not through lack of usage and lack of popular demand by the local population. Today, actually, I've just been told that one of those Crown branches is going to be transferred to a nearby convenience store, a convenience store which is much smaller than the existing post office. It's only operated since 2013, and on the upside, there'll be extended opening hours on Saturdays and Sundays, and there'll be new disability access. But on the downside, nobody believes that this store is big enough to house a replacement Crown post office. It will have fewer serving positions. There's serious concerns over queues already. It will not be able to have the biometric enrolment service used for home office applications. There's obviously concerns about staff transfer, and we know from those post offices that have converted so far that only 10 out of 400 staff have TUPE'd across. They're often going into minimum wage jobs, so question marks over ongoing training for those staff now working in non-Crown post offices. They've tended to have a big turnover of staff, has been the experience as well. And in many of those shops, staff hours get cut. And after the initial promises about extended opening times, they tend to retrench. And what happens if the model fails as well? Some 8,000 sub-post offices are now in convenience stores. And the experience of convenience stores has seen a 4% reduction in hours of their staff just since the national living wage came in, and some 30% of businesses are facing challenges about revaluation of business rates as well. And as we've seen from the Dalton's website, there are currently 705 post office branches for sale. So there is a lot of change and churn in this sector, so longer-term questions about the viability and sustainability of those new arrangements obviously arrive. There's also another issue, because both my post offices are co-located with sorting offices, obviously not run by the post office, but run by Royal Mail, but very conveniently next to the post office. And again, experience has been that without those anchor partnership tenants, those sorting offices are relocated to out-of-town sites. Much less convenient for people to be able to go and get their deliveries from, particularly when you're dealing with an elderly population who may not be so mobile. So we're going to have a consultation, an extended consultation, because of the election on my post office, but of course, as we all know, there is not a single consultation that has overturned any of the proposals to transfer these post offices. So I fear it is something of a token exercise, other than the measurements of an access door might be changed by a few inches, or things, or the sweet counter might be relocated because it gets in the way of guide dogs or whatever. But frankly, it's a token exercise. Now, I'm aware that Citizens Advice do a good job in being the oversight body, and I'm aware some of their research has suggested that in the new format there has been some improvements in some cases to access, in some cases to service as well. But overall, the fears are that the queues get longer, the timings take longer, the service is less consistent, you're dealing with different and new staff, and it's just not as good as it used to be. So that brings me to my second point, Sir Edward, is where exactly is the Post Office going? Because everything the Post Office has done, and those statistics I've mentioned in terms of making it more efficient, in terms of reducing losses, etc., and perhaps extending some hours, are all based on retrenchment. It's all based on a policy that sees the Post Office, certainly the directly owned Post Office, getting smaller and offering fewer services to its customers. Fewer than 300 will be directly owned, employing Crown Post Offices. The financial services part of the Post Office, which should be a big money spinner, is diminishing. At the beginning of the year, 150 financial specialists were made redundant. There was a financial specialist office in the Lancing Post Office, which was closed earlier this year. The mortgage specialist advice they give, because of their relationship with the Bank of Ireland, gets a one-off payment, I gather, of just £800 for brokering mortgages, no ongoing revenue. That seems to be selling themselves very cheap, and they're caught in that relationship until 2023, and it doesn't sound as though it's very profitable for the Post Office. So my question, Sir Edward, to the Minister, and I hope she'll be able to enlighten us more, is why is the Post Office not making more on banking and financial services in particular, given they are a trusted name, a presence on the high street, at a time when conventional banks are disappearing from the high street? Now, I gather the revenue of post offices breaks down roughly, of some 47% is the revenue from stamp sales, and increasingly those are available to buy anywhere. Then there's government services for DVLA services, fishing licences, DWP card account, but of course those are all being squeezed and the revenue from them has been reducing. There's the access to current accounts, banks as I've already mentioned, and now banking protocols have been sorted out so they can cross-fertilise the different bank branches within a post office, which had been a problem. And then there's the post office financial services, where again it seems to be a declining market for the post office. So why are they not copying the example of the challenger banks, for example, where you've got banks like Metro and Handelsbank, which are making a really good fist of expanding into these markets? Metro now has 915,000 customers, has taken £8 billion in deposit, has 110 branches, and is growing. Or why, as honourable members have mentioned in these debates before, are we not doing what they've done in France, one thing we might want to copy from France, with the La Banque Postale, which was founded in 2006 specifically as a tool to help tackle financial exclusion, and now in 2016 has a turnover of €5.6 billion and a pre-tax profit of just over €1 billion. There are other examples in New Zealand and Italy. A fantastic opportunity, surely, for the state-owned post office to be taking advantage of changing markets in how we do our financial business by somebody who's trusted, is on the high street, who is there, but for some reason is not taking advantage of that. Why are they not making more of click and collect services? Everywhere I go now, there are shops sprouting up on high streets specifically for people to be able to collect their Amazon deliveries and others because they're not at home to do it. The post office is already on those high streets, surely could be offering those sorts of services, and yet 80% of post offices, I gather, don't have those sorts of facilities, and they particularly won't have them if they're moving to smaller premises where they just don't have the room to store and collect those parcels. So the overall commercial revenue of the post office has been virtually stagnant in the last few years. So it's a great mystery, Sir Edward, as to why the post office is not at this time expanding, becoming more profitable, better for the taxpayer and for their customers, rather than following a long-term strategy which appears to be based on retrenchment and shrinking. So finally, Sir Edward, some questions I'd just like the Minister to answer, other than the bigger question, is what is the big game plan for the Post Office? The network transformation programme is due to end by March of 2018, by when some 7,500 traditional sub-post offices will have been converted to the new model. What comes next after March 2018 in terms of subsidy and further transformation revenues? In opinion polls, 85% of the public support the government continuing, the taxpayer continuing to subsidise the post office, and not just the obvious challenges facing rural post offices, where clearly they was going to have the sparsity challenge. Are any further reductions in Crown Network offices planned in the next year? And also, as the citizen advice have suggested, will there be an automatic break if 5% of branches announce that they are to be closed without breaking the access criteria, which it's quite hard to do anyway? But I think the biggest question, Sir Edward, is why is the Post Office not using current opportunities to expand rather than retrenching, particularly as it has the security of government backing for its revenues and is a trusted name. In 2010, when the government promised to transform the Post Office, I'm on my final sentence, Sir Edward. In 2010, when the government promised to transform the Post Office into a genuine front office for the government and for a significant expansion in its banking services, in reality, I fear, Sir Edward, it's failed so far on these measures, as the revenues from government services has fallen by 40% and income from financial services has been stagnated. Closing down flagship branches, getting rid of experienced staff and putting counters into the back of a WH Smith's or a bargain booze is surely not a plan for growth or innovation, which I think is what our constituents want to see.